All the time. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all here today. On behalf of the Canadian League of Composers, I'd like to welcome everyone here to the space of the CMC. And I'd really like to thank you all for joining us for this discussion on gender and cultural equality in new music. I'm joined here today by Reiche Iwaasa, D.B. Boyko, Farshid Samandari, and Lan Tung. I'd also like to let you know that today's conversation is being filmed. We are taking special care to be only filming the panelists. But once we get to our question and answer period, if you are feeling that you want to ask a question, but don't want your voice recorded on documentation, please, and I know we didn't talk about this before, but Stacy, could you be the person that would relay their question? So just have a look back there. I think we all know who Stacy is, but if you want to ask a question but don't want to have your voice recorded, please speak to Stacy there. Before going any further, I would like to acknowledge the ancestral and traditional and unceded Aboriginal territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and in particular the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations on whose territory we currently stand. I would also like to thank Alicia Denberg and Brian Harmon, the Canadian League of Composers, for their support in making today a possibility, as well as the Canadian Music Centre for their use of their space. About a year ago, the Canadian League of Composers formed an equity committee. The inspiration for this committee came from a presentation made to Council by Anna Hossman. Essentially, the proposal was that the Canadian League of Composers adopt and endorse a policy of gender equity and find ways to redistribute opportunities and resources to better represent and encourage the participation of women in the Canadian composition community. Very quickly, we realized that it was necessary to advocate for a more inclusive definition of equity in the field of music that included gender and cultural diversity. And it's within that context that today's panel discussion came about. The way that today will unfold is that we're going to start with short presentations by each of the panelists, and that will be followed by a very short break. Many of us are here on the weekend of the AGM of the CLC, so we've been in a lot of meetings. So we're going to really appreciate that very short break. Followed by that break, we'll be opening the floor for questions and discussions, and I ask that you save your questions and comments for that time. So our first panelist today is Reiche Iwaasa. Rachel is a pianist who performs solo and chamber music and is known for her passion for contemporary music and numerous performances of new music and premieres. She is also the founder and current director of development for the Queer Arts Festival here in Vancouver. So please take it away, Rachel.
So as Chris said, my name is Reiche Iwaasa. I'm a contemporary music pianist. My pronoun is she. I'm half white, and I'm queer. Now, you probably read me as a woman before I said anything. And if my features don't give away my Japanese ancestry, my surname does. But queers are often an invisible minority. For you to know I'm queer, you probably have to see me with my very butch partner, or somebody has to tell you. Now, that's probably going to be me because I'm professionally queer, and that sounds a little bit like gay for pay, but actually means I work as the Director of Development for the Queer Arts Festival. It's an artist-run transdisciplinary festival in Vancouver, recognized in the Australian press as one of the top 5 festivals of its kind worldwide. QAF harnesses the visceral power of the arts to inspire recognition, respect, and visibility for people who transgress gender and sexual norms. QAF brings diverse communities together to support artistic risk-taking, incite creative collaboration and experimentation, and and celebrate the rich heritage of queers in the literary, media, performing, and visual arts. So as an administrator, that means that I've focused since 2006 on lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, two-spirit, and intersex artists. That alphabet soup pronounced queer, on whose behalf I've been asked to speak today. It's not a straightforward task. To quote Trin Min Ha, how do you inscribe difference without bursting into a series of euphoric, narcissistic accounts of yourself and your own kind? Without indulging in a marketable romanticism or a naive whining about your condition? Between the twin chasms of navel-gazing and navel erasing, the ground is narrow and slippery, and none of us can pride ourselves on being sure-footed there. But here goes. The arts are honeycombed with homosexuals. As QAF Artistic Director S.D. Holman says, if you love art, then you love queer art. From Sappho to Da Vinci, Kahlo to Van Cliburn, queers are ubiquitous in all the genres. People used to say, she's artistic, or is he musical, as code words, meaning queer. Take Wikipedia's list of LGBT composers. For all it lacks in rigor and Canadian content, what Wiki does well is take a snapshot of public perception. There are 137 composers on their list, and it includes some of history's most illustrious names. In some periods and places, queer artists arguably are the mainstream. Yet, official biographies often omit their sexuality. Case in point, a giant of 20th century art music died earlier this year, and the obituaries had conspicuously no mention of any personal life. When a straight person dies, significant others are always mentioned. And yet mainstream media would have us believe that this brilliant, passionate artist had nobody who ever loved him. Instead, social media that buzzed with, was he or wasn't he? Our history, relegated to rumor and innuendo. Artists who face multiple barriers are even less likely to be out in their practice. Less than 14% of Wikipedia's list are women, even fewer are people of color, and only one self-identifies as trans. When I solicited the Hive Mind to help me build a list of trans composers, half the replies came as discreet, direct messages, or they were prefaced by, let me check to see if they are out. But with so many queers in the canon, why the discretion? Queers are, by some estimates, 10% of the population, but Stats Canada reports that we were targets for 16% of our country's hate crimes in the last year that it was recorded, 2013. 66 of those were violent attacks, and that's double or triple the rate of assaults motivated by race or religion. Hate crimes have decreased overall from 2012, but hate crimes against queers have actually increased. And yet Canada Council doesn't recognize queers as an equity category. Meanwhile, our artists express worry that presenting their work as queer will pigeonhole them and limit future opportunities. And they're not unfounded. We have grant officers at all levels that try to steer openly queer projects into community funding streams, regardless of whether they have any community-engaged practice. One Globe and Mail music critic told me straight out, queer art is basically crap. I said, but Vivier and Auden are two of your favorite artists, and they're queer. And he countered, yeah, but they don't make queer art. Could you imagine saying, sure, Vivier was Québécois, but he didn't make Québécois art? Our inclusion depends on our polite silence. Now, some say, look at that history. You can't say that queers don't have access. You can be out in your private life. It's the art that matters. Why bring sexuality into it? Why do you have to flaunt it? Because philosophers, from Darwin to Freud to Deleuze to Groucho, have all argued that the artistic and sexual drives flow from the same wellsprings of creativity and pleasure. Because it's no coincidence that a closeted queer gave us the most radical piece of the last century, that as an heir to the silence that is criminally vulgar, as Morrissey put it, Cage taught us that silence has something important to teach us if only we really listen. Because, as electroacoustic composer Barry Truax wrote, art is said to mirror society, but if you look in the mirror and see no reflection, then the implicit message is that you don't exist. And queer youth who attempt suicide at 7 times the national average are clearly getting that message. Because I was gallery sitting at Queer Arts Festival when a group of 14-year-old boys came in after their basketball game. They stopped in front of a hard-hitting work by Mary Taylor called Homophobia Kills, which documents a decade of homophobic and transphobic murders. They stood there laughing and joking, and I'll admit I didn't know what to do. Just then, QAF's president Jeff Gibson came by, and he talked to them about the work, what it was about, and why it was important. The boys quickly grew silent and thoughtful, but the best part, 20 minutes later, they returned with the rest of their basketball team, and they taught them about the horror of gay bashing through the lens of the art. That is the power of art. In less than half an hour, these youth had transformed from bullies to advocates. Make no mistake, art is powerful, transformative. It reaches us in ways that rational argument never will. To paraphrase Leonard Bernstein, art changes people, and people change the world. The question becomes, how do we want it to change? Thank you.
Our second panelist today is D.B. Boyko. She's a specialist in experimental voice, composer, and curator for over 30 years, and has initiated and participated in many collaborative projects involving contemporary music. DB is the co-founder of several improvising ensembles. He's a specialist in traditional vocal repertoire for Central Japanese Gamelan, and has devoted much energy to producing the works of others as director-curator for the music program at the Vancouver Artist-Run Centre, the Western Front.
Thank you, Rachel, for that. And that's really important to hear all those statistics and be mindful of that as we are cultural workers, as artists and presenters and curators, and I think it is our job to be mindful of how we're representing the largesse of society. Anyways, I started to think about having done this work for quite some time. And really the question that comes to me is, what is new music and who participates and what genres, forms and lyrics fall within those boundaries. And so I've just sort of put that out there at the beginning, and maybe we'll get to that. I'm going to talk about a few different things, and one of them was also sent to me as a message, and I'll reveal that in a short bit. So I'm the messenger. Don't shoot me. But I guess over my 20-odd-ish years of curating at the Western Front, I just sort of realized that I've been doing interventions there. And first off, I did that in 1997 with starting the View from the Front series. What I did is collaborated with the Women in View Festival, which really had established itself to look at the work of women, mostly in theater at that time, and so I was pretty new at what I was doing, and I was pretty brash about just walking and saying, well, your music programming sucks, we need to actually introduce some contemporary music by women, and started to put together a series of works inviting people from the creative music scene, from the music scene, also indigenous artists at that time, and people from different parts of the world. I had a hard time actually tracing back through exactly when I completed all of that work, but it ran for about 5 or 6 years, and I got to that place where I felt, okay, I think perhaps we've made some adjustments here, and I could see that around me that there was more presence of women working in contemporary music or being presented. But that certainly does ebb and flow, as I've seen that over the years. But I just felt it was time to retire that. And somewhere in that time frame, and I don't have the date on it, as I was madly searching through files that have been saved in other places that I can't find, I worked with the Now Society and worked with Ron Samworth and Cote Cook at that time on a project to try to invite different people from the community, from different kinds of cultural perspectives and different kinds of music making, to begin to improvise within the community. One of those people was Lan, Mayhan, Bick, as well as playing with some other leading improvisers within the community. And what developed out of that was an ensemble called Crossing Borders that did some work for a couple of years, and then that also retired itself. So these are all ideas and just trying to find ways to kind of just kickstart some ideas. And it's not like people were not doing these practices before, but just trying to put a spotlight on that and hopefully allow for some connections and networking to happen. More recently, I just last weekend actually hosted a large gathering of Indigenous artists, scholars from throughout North America, working with Dylan Robinson, who is now posted as chair at Queen's University, Candace Hopkins, who was a former curator of visual art at the Western Front, and Kelsey Wrightson. And the invitation was to over 40 artists and scholars to come to actually talk about sovereignty from a very different perspective, but from the doing of it and from an artistic perspective. And I guess that's why I was feeling a little bit emotional after you spoke there, because it was an incredibly emotional experience for me. It was quite overwhelming in their ability to listen to one another and speak in a form that was, I guess I would say, Longhouse style, and that was a new experience for me. And lots of uncomfortable things were talked about, which was, I had made that invitation, and it was challenging for everybody in that room. And it was pretty well exclusive to that community. But I felt it was really important to have a space for them to have these conversations. And my ulterior motive in all of this is try to find a way for that community to feel at home within the community of contemporary music practice. There were a lot of visual artists there. There's a lot of lexicon and language around how they, frame what they're looking at. We don't have that in contemporary music, and I'm always frustrated around the fact that we haven't developed our language around that. But this space was for them to create their own sense of identity and their own way of describing stuff. And what they were doing, they've been framing it in different ways, and they were framing it from a perspective of sound making and song. So there's a lot of that work will be available, which was documented, and be available to the rest of the world. But I asked Dylan at the end of it, I said, I had this incredibly profound experience from this, and how do we bring this back into these other kinds of communities, And so he says, well, those group of people, it is their responsibility to bring that out. So anyways, I'm always trying to figure out ways to broker that, and I don't have the answer to that now, but certainly I have included Indigenous artists in projects over the years. So I'm looking for ways to make that happen. But one of the things that came out of that, we had a performance. Am I going too long?
No.
Okay. We had a performance, and that included some more traditionally based song, female singers with drums. Actually, we invited one person, and then two other women got up spontaneously to perform. We also had a very brilliant young singer who's originally from Halifax, who's Maliseet, and he was working with transcriptions early archival transcriptions and singing. He's just a beautiful trained operatic singer, but is really approaching things in his own really unique way that I would call contemporary. Whether I would call that new music is kind of irrelevant, but this is sort of where I'm focusing in on is how people identify in terms of making original music, and maybe we have to kind of re-evaluate how we define contemporary music practice. Jack Hahn, and who works, who played electric guitar, but he does a lot of interactive work. He writes string quartets. He, I would say, is definitely a new music composer, performer, working with Laura Ortman, who is based in Brooklyn, who's a violinist. And that part of the program was definitely within that sort of creative music scene, and it sort of fulfilled that niche. And the next day in the conference, people were kind of commenting on that there's some people were, they were unsure as how to place that within the context of this more traditional practices. But one of the, I spoke with Cheryl Lerondelle, who was one of the women who did actually sing and play drum, and the conversation was about the fact that drumming is actually a male, traditionally a male practice, and it's actually part of a society. And so what she's been doing has been playing drum and singing and composing her own work. She is the only woman who is composing round dance style of songs. And so what's happening within a traditional context is a flipping of the paradigm of changing the gender perspective on that. So this becomes contemporary music in a very different way and participating in a different way. So, I mean, when I started doing this in the 1990s, I was always looking at what was new in music making. It didn't have to be new music. And so I keep seeing this arising again and again. And so we need to find the ways for all of those things to participate side by side. Ironically, the man that was also unsure about that also expressed the feeling that maybe some traditional things might just have to die, and things, have a chance to decay and come back again. So, I'm sort of looking at the broader perspective of how we are practicing, where we are coming from, what is our tradition, what are we breaking away from. So they're all really unique in terms of what is contemporary music, who has access, who's practicing. Okay, I'm not going to say too much about this, but I got an email from Jeff Morton from Canada Council on Friday, and he sent me some work, some statistics that they looked around women composers and commissioning. And ironically, there is, I don't want to read it to you right now, but anyways, about a quarter of the submissions are from women, and those women actually do about 2.7% better than men in terms of actually receiving the funding. But the bottom line is that organizations have not been standing up to their abilities to actually put in applications on behalf of women composers. So that is something that I think that we need to look at, and not to say that it's not happening. And I expressed that with Jeff on the phone. I said, that has been something that I've advocated for years, as you hear what I've been doing here, but there are times when things don't seem to fall in the right place at the right time, and then you do feel incredibly uncomfortable about not always having that balance. But I think so. Prerequisites. We need to just have a sea change in how we feel and we think about it. But I wouldn't want to be completely prescriptive around that. What I see are really impacting all this are pedagogical issues. And at the conference, Canadian Music Network conference, I don't know how many years ago it was, but it was about education, and what kept coming up in those conversations was that a lot of the teachers, which were women, were uncomfortable teaching composition, and I found this really strange, because then these were women who trained as instrumentalists, or some of them even as improvisers. And I said, well, you already have those skills there. Why are you not using them to teach that? I mean, if obviously to teach high-end orchestration, that is understandable, but there are other ways of making music and other ways of transferring that to children. So, and I spoke to an educator who was, I think at UQuam, and I said, like, what's going on with this? And really the training is around how the role models still exist, that people learn an instrument. And I didn't do that, so I gag at this. I didn't go through it that way. But people learn how to play, women learn how to play an instrument, the piano, sing, and then they don't realize themselves in a way that role model is supposed to be, and then they end up teaching. And they're then not well equipped to actually think about composing and to think about things in much more in diverse ways. I mean, I know Murray Schafer's books are in those curriculums that do pose different ways to thinking about music making, but there's a breakdown in that part of it. So, solutions. I've been doing several projects with youth in schools, very successful with a program in Burnaby. It's the only one. It does not happen in Vancouver. Vancouver, I have to go in with a machine gun and a machete to even try to get some action in there. They're stuck in a very different time frame, but I actually go into different kinds of classrooms, to literary classrooms, just different ways so that we can access kids, so that we start to think about musical literacy in different ways, because kids have a different frame of reference for that. And but this program in Burnaby North, they actually do sound production and recording, and so the kids in there, and girls are actually getting a chance to think about musical literacy in a very different way. So that's been quite successful. And then the next step of that is what I've noticed is that we've been trying to bring younger artists in to start working with those kids, because they actually have better computer literacy skills. They're also generationally much more connected to where they're at, but they don't possess the engagement skills. And not only is it younger artists, it's artists across all ages actually don't understand it. Some of it is classroom experience, but some of it is also about trying to engage people to be motivated to think for themselves. And what I've seen in going into those classroom situations is a high level of anxiety. Kids are really struggling to have self-confidence in what they're doing. So trying to create some scenarios and connections for people, for kids at different generations are really important. So anyways, I'm starting a new project this fall where we're going to take 6 sound artists and composers and give them the training to work in the classrooms, to work in community centers, which is a very different way of working, so that they can start to change those paradigms. So anyways, education. Thanks.
So next we have Farshid Samandari. Farshid's compositional output reflects his interest in contemporary classical vocabulary, spectral analysis, and extended techniques, including the integration and synthesis of different ethnic musics and vocabulary in his music. He has collaborated with various choirs and ensembles all over the world, including the Tehran National Symphony, the Vancouver Intercultural Orchestra, the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra, and the Orchid Ensemble, to name a few.
I should apologize first that I'm not going to do any presentation as serious as either one of you have done. I was preparing some drafts and I realized that my first reaction to the topic was, oh, this is a great topic. And then my second reaction was that, why we are doing this? And my next reaction was that this is a great time to do it. And then again I thought that, aren't we in 21st century? Are we still talking and dealing with this topic? Yes. So as I was saying that basically I had quite a bit of conflict where to start and what to talk about. And then I thought that maybe I should say a little bit about my own past, and then was probably would have some interesting experiences that in some ways probably are very unique. So probably as you might know, I was born in Iran and I was there till 2000, I moved here in 2001. And after 78 revolution in Iran, music was banned for about 10 years. It was just generally banned. So all the musical activity that we were doing was underground, it was criminal, and you could have been persecuted or in prison for just singing. Didn't matter what. In fact, I was arrested twice, the second time for having a choir. So that was one experience. The other one actually relates to one of the groups that I work with, National Symphony Orchestra in Tehran. I got a commission in '99 to write a new piece for them. The orchestra was just forming. We were forming something similar to what I'm working with now, probably Boyko. They formed basically an orchestra that had Western instruments and a huge number of Persian instruments. It was about 80 instruments. And they were planning to start have the inaugural concert, and they didn't have any repertoire in 2 months. So they needed desperately a new piece. So I wrote the piece for them. They started rehearsing, and then within a week I got a call that we can't perform your piece because you happen to be a Baha'i, you're banned. And then around the same time, the same thing happened. I had the article in Music Journal that was banned. Actually, the whole journal was banned because of just my name, which was incidentally mistyped to make me look like an Armenian, but it didn't work. And so in 20th century and early 21st century, we still have this situation. I'm still connected with kids there, and I have some students that at times I really feel sorry, I don't know what to do, how to help kids to continue pursuing the arts or music or whatever they want to do. So that's part of the work, that this thing is actually happening in a very open manner. But then when I moved here, I saw the other side of it. That kind of it's also very interesting. One of the first reactions that I often have seen by colleagues and others when they hear that I'm a musician is that, do you play santur or do you play guitar? Neither one. I play piano. Why? And so it takes quite some time to explain that actually you could be a Iranian musician and don't know anything about any of those instruments. And in fact, the community there is quite segregated. I was one of the few that was crossing the line and often criticized by both. Are you stupid working with Persian instruments? And the other ones, why do you want to work with us? Why should you work with us? And so here I saw the other side of it. That's because you're coming from that background, you should be able to play one of those instruments that we know of. And if you don't, probably there is something wrong. It just doesn't make sense. And then I had the funniest experience. I was playing, improvising with a jazz musician. And the trumpet players suggested that let's improvise on an Indian rock. And he presented the rock and played a little bit of it, and it was interesting, so we did it. And after the concert, people approached me and said that this was a perfect East meets West. And you were presenting East and he was presenting West. Yeah, truly. That was exactly how it went. I had to learn the Indian rock from an American jazz trumpet player, and then everyone thinks that's the other way around. So I think that if you want to look at all these issues that Rachel brought up, and my own experience and everything that David was talking about, we are dealing with 4 different groups, in my opinion. We are dealing with artists, we are dealing with curators, we are dealing with organizations, and we are dealing with community. And I think all of them are responsible. The artists are responsible to stand up and do their work, continue, don't get disappointed. You get blocked, you'll find another way. The curators should be open, should try to embrace. The organization should try to embrace. But then if we don't have the community behind us, doesn't matter how far you want to go, we can't achieve anything. So as long as we stay in our ivory towers of making new music that is only for us, few people, we can't succeed to have equity, we can't succeed to have openness and embracing all the members of different members of our community. So I think that one of the challenges that I've experienced since I've been working in Canada, both as a composer and at times as a programmer or curator, is that how can I entertain diversity or interesting the artists, keeping the organization flourishing and receiving the funding from grantors, and then at the same time be able to communicate with the community and the audience and challenge the audience enough that they would accept it, the changes that we are going through. And this is, I think, in my opinion, the challenge that we are all facing, and it's not difficult, but it's time-consuming.
Thank you. Our 4th panelist for today is Lan Tung. Playing a dynamic role in Canadian music scene, Lan Tung is an erhu performer, vocalist, composer, producer, and artistic director. She draws inspiration from a background in Chinese music. However, her influences range from contemporary music, creative improvisation, to various ethnic styles such as Indian, flamenco, and Middle Eastern. She is founder of the Orchid Ensemble, Proliferation, and artistic director of the Sound of Dragon Festival.
So I guess I'll talk from the perspective of Chinese music in Canadian music, in contemporary music. But first, the history of how it started. And it's actually very recent. If you go back to just 30 years ago in the 80s, before the 80s, the general impression of Chinese music is the instruments are out of tune, and musicians cannot play, so you can never do anything with them other than pentatonic scales. I don't know if anyone remember those assumptions. And even when I first arrived, I still heard some of them, like 20 years ago. So at least I think in the music community, this assumption does not exist anymore, but outside the music community, maybe some people still think this way. And this is also all because of the exposure of Chinese music in the past, perhaps going to Chinese restaurants, and especially if hearing Cantonese opera singers when you go walking through Chinatown and the Cantonese opera clubs, they had the singers who were not professional and they were practicing and they can sing out of tune, and also the players were not professional. So the change comes in the late 1980s and early 1990s is when professional musicians arrived, and that's the first time people had the contact to real musicians who really know how to play the instruments and train in conservatory environments in Asia. And they came over with their instruments, then people start to get exposure to how the instruments are supposed to sound like. So that's the beginning of Chinese music in Canadian contemporary compositions. And also I see this as like 3 stages. So before 1980s, there was only amateur musicians in Vancouver, and then from the late 80s on, there were quite a wave of musicians arriving, and then but during that time, the Chinese music community is still small, and like the Chinese population, although it's quite a few, but it's still small to sustain musicians working just in the community. So it was quite necessary for musicians to collaborate and work and explore different directions. So therefore, you had the professional Chinese ensembles, and most ensembles are more or less reaching out and doing different collaborations. And so first you have the developments of kind of world music type ensembles, like the time we had, I think you have heard of Iwaasa, and you combining instruments from different cultures, and also the Chinese ensembles, Silk Road Music and Vancouver Chinese Ensemble, like everyone tried a different approach and working with different musicians. And when I first arrived, my first gig was doing a theater and with Indian and Celtic musicians and actors. And then so my first year working here in the 90s, working a lot with Indian musicians, and just how they started. And just there's a lot more of this kind of opportunity, and also was necessary because we could not just form a Chinese orchestra with the people we had here, and not enough instruments, not enough players, and not enough opportunities. So basically, there are the Chinese ensembles formed around that time. The Vancouver Chinese Ensemble, and mine is the Orchid Ensemble and Silk Road Music. These are still going today. And also, soon after that, there are more fusion ensembles. For example, I started a band called Birds of Paradox with Ron Sanders and on guitar, and Neil G. Dillon on tabla and saxophone. Started in 2005. And also around the same time, I played in a band, Tandava, it's Indian folk music. But the same time of developing with world music or fusion styles, there was another direction most Chinese ensembles and musicians explored was to work with composers. So this is more like both directions. The composers are just as eager as the musicians to try out with the different instruments. In the early 90s, we had a number of composers writing mostly for the instruments, Mark Armini and Moshe Denver here, and also John Oliver, and a few Chinese composers, Li Peiming or Jing Jian, Reiche, and there's a small pool of composers interested writing in these instruments. But another direction of exploration, like world music and contemporary music, and then it's improvisation. And I would say special thank you for DV that you talk about the Crossing Borders Ensemble, because that was an introduction point for a number of our musicians on non-Chinese, non-Western instruments to enter into the world of improvised music, and pretty much changed our careers. And today we're still improvising a lot, and that came from those days. So although the ensemble didn't last very long, but our career started, and it's a new direction we started from those days. So thank you very much. And so then the third stage of developments, the past decade or 10, 15 years, Chinese music community has a different way of, they can actually pretty much sustain itself within the Chinese population. So there are a lot, some musicians arriving, and we will never see them outside the community because they do not need to. There's enough to teach and perform for the community. And so they become a choice of who wants to explore and who wants to even learn English and who wants to come on and try different things. So this is a very different time, and also there are a number of new projects formed this time, and like the Vancouver Intercultural Orchestra including Chinese musicians, instruments, and Nico Lee's piano and Erhu duo with Korean, and the BC Chinese Ensemble. And so these are all the different ensembles. We have some of the younger generation musicians trained in Vancouver who have accomplished quite well technically and untraditional repertoire, but still, like, except for a couple of them, still most of them do not come out from the community or playing anything other than traditional music. So I'm not quite sure how we can change this, because obviously they are not taking music as a profession. So maybe we'll have another generation to wait before we can see this change. There's a lot more interest among composers and a lot more knowledge among composers about how to write to the instruments or wanting to write for the instruments. So the pool of composers has increased. That of course means lots of different style of music has been written for the instruments, and also different things people are trying in different projects. And I'll say the challenges in using Chinese instruments in contemporary music. First, the opportunities to perform. Very often we have to wait. People think of a special seasonal celebration. That's when we'll have featured Chinese instruments. For example, Chinese New Year or a multicultural week. So very often you have to wait for this kind of special events to be featured. And so, of course, this is changing. There are a lot more opportunities, but this is pretty often in people's mindset. So we're still as a special cultural offering, not a normal part of programming. And another thing is about commissioning. We're talking about the pool of composers being increased, but a lot of time it's pretty difficult to commission composers who has no experience writing for non-Western instruments. They can be very excellent composers and really willing to try, but it's really hard to convince the council that to give the composers a chance to try this and compose for us. So this is the case with Canada Council, and wasn't as difficult for BCR's Council. They would grant composers who were new to the genre. However, BCR's Council commissioning was cancelled 10 years ago. So it's been a difficult growth, and other composers wanting to write for the instruments have to do it for free, or start with something small for free, and hopefully build a repertoire before they can present their applications. So for myself, I started the orchid ensemble in 1997. So we're having our 20 years next year. And when we first started, the ensembles just purely Chinese ensemble. The first 2 years, we had 3 Chinese women playing 3 Chinese instruments. And most of you probably do not know about that, because now the orchid ensemble is known as 2 Chinese instruments with the Western percussion and marimba. And so when we had a change, that was in 1999. We let the Chinese dulcimer player left the ensemble, and we had to replace, and we didn't have another dulcimer player in town to be as good. So Jonathan Bernard volunteers. He's going to play the dulcimer part on the marimba. So that works, of course, after experimenting and trying out different and developing repertoire. Then we realized we have a whole range of percussion instruments to work with, and also we have a lot of encouragement from composers, because now that this is a really interesting instrumentation to work with. So from 1999, we start to commission many different composers to have different works. So this is the orchid ensemble. I have 2 Chinese instruments and a percussion instrument. So our first developments, of course, so we talk about influence in fusion style and raw music. So we have, well, not exactly fusion, but very melodic. Piece by Moshe Denver. So that's an example, like with the earlier pieces we commissioned. This was written 2002.
2001.
2001, and still being performed like 30 times a year, at least. and then later on we start to after 2006 we start to develop a lot more into interdisciplinary projects with multimedia and dance, and we commissioned the more different works. This is by Dorsey Chen, and so we started to work a lot with multimedia, and we found this is people becoming more visual, so it's a good way to introduce contemporary works. So you can see these are all the different production we have with multimedia and also with dance. And another program we developed especially for the tour is a choir collaboration. A lot of ensemble do project with orchestras, and so we do with choir, and there are certainly more choirs around, and so we do a lot of work and get them involved in different works, different compositions and Canadian works. This is a piece by Jing Zhen, and this is very abstract. Give it a louder section. So that by participation in the choir and learning the repertoire, they experience how the language and the stylist, the inflections, and sometimes they learn the percussion parts. And we also have piece that's body percussion and built into part of the piece, and also some very rhythmic traditional rhythms, but also pieces are contemporary and also pieces in different languages. And so this program has been very popular on tours. as example from the pieces.
1 minute.
1 minute. Okay. So I'll just jump over to talk about a little bit. Sound of Dragon Society started 2013, and we had our first festival in 2014. And the idea of the Sound of Dragon Society is to promote the Chinese instrumental music, or also vocal music, Chinese music of different styles, and the possibilities of using the instruments in different genres, and also focus on cross-cultural collaboration and contemporary applications. So the biennial festivals are usually last 3-4 days, and we have presented for about 20 concerts the first year, and that's pretty much including the whole community in Vancouver, and a lot of the musicians collaborating, creating new projects. And 2016 also, we just finished our festival. And usually we host international artists as well as local artists. And one thing very important for us is when we had international artists, we want to make sure there's collaboration with the locals, so they not just come and leave. We give enough time for collaboration, so they may perform Canadian composers' work, or they have a soloist local, or they are soloists with the local ensembles. So there's a true collaboration and exchange, and also helps to build possibilities of future works for our artists and composers. So this is, and also in 2015 we launched the Sound of Dragon Ensemble, and the ensemble has a mix of Chinese and Western instruments. And our first concert was this year, and the co-first scores we had received more than 30 works from composers from 13 countries. And this is it's about the ensemble.
The festival. And the ensemble you're hearing rehearsing today is the Sound of Dragon Ensemble. And as you can see, it's a mix of Western.
I can move this up.
And Chinese instruments. And this ensemble started particularly as an ensemble of the festival, but of course we'll be able to produce concerts outside the festival as well. So of course, as you can hear, the music is not that traditional, and as I just described, with many different styles of music, and the particular focus of the festival is on the contemporary application of the instruments, and also on the cross-cultural aspects. For more information, please check on the
Thank you.
All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. Okay. We will revisit the snacks after. But right now, I'm glad we had that little moment just to think, because we've heard a lot of different perspectives today and a lot of different comments. It was kind of daunting to put together a panel on gender and cultural equity. Really, this should be something that could be like a whole weekend of discussions. That this topic is so big. I know we're going to open the floor to questions, but I would like to start with a question, just to get the ball rolling. So my question is, the composer-performer relationship and concert ritual and performance practices around new music is heavily influenced by Western ideals. And often those ideals are evoked as a way to differentiate new music from other musical genres. Do you think these ideals are a hindrance to cultural diversity in new music? Would you like to?
Well, yeah, I think one reason why Chinese musicians are so involved with contemporary composers is because the training of Chinese music today is very similar to Western training. So we have all the same reading skill that's required, and the exercise and doing scales, just like how you be training Western instrumentalists, and also the basic knowledge of Western music theory. And so that certainly makes it easier than working with, for example, Indian musicians who don't read, coming totally from oral tradition. So this is always one thing that's we're always considering and always trying to figure out the balance. Is how do you involve people who cannot read, great musicians, and whether you should write for them or why do you write for them when they are great composers themselves. And this composer and performer relationship is pretty Western classical perspective. Doesn't actually exist in some cultures.
I disagree.
You're going to disagree?
Yeah. Well, almost all the cultures have composers and have had composers, but the relation have been different. In the same way that, like, Mozart played many of his piano concertos himself, and he didn't want others to play it. The same way, like Indian sitarists write it and make it their own music because they don't want to lose the gig. It's just economics of the music. And as the music started to become more museum art, that you can actually record stuff and repeat it, then the concept of composers started to become more relevant. It was more relevant in Europe because the notation came to being a little sooner, but it was available in most of the East, in fact, as far as my understanding goes. And obviously the relation and interaction between composers and performers are slightly different at times. But we need to also remember that most of the musicians that we work with are not necessarily representing the entire culture. They're representing themselves. Some of them have some training of their instrument from someone in some city. So it quite a big statement to make that like even Indian musicians can't read. Like that has been my experience, that many of them, these Indian musicians, have difficulty reading music because the musical concept is different than Indian music. They don't have notes per se. It's just an event that they're doing. But nevertheless, the new generation of Indian musicians are reading musicians, and they're dealing with composers all the time, and they have an electroacoustic music scene that is vibrant and works with all the traditional instruments. So
and that is Western influenced, Western concept.
Yes, but they had their own notations. They had their own notation system that fits what they were doing, that fit their own language. The same way that like the script that they have for Indian language fits Indian language. They don't need to use Roman characters to present their language. The same way they had a notation that was fitting for Indian music. And the same to the other cultures.
This doesn't quite speak to the composer-performer divide, but I do think that the concert ritual and that the sort of box that we put around that, I think it does limit the diversity of our audiences. I don't know in terms of the, I can't speak so much in terms of the musicians coming in, but what comes to mind is being at a Victoria Symphony concert years ago, and these two skaters who sat down in front of me, and one of them said to the other, "So dude, this isn't like a normal concert. You just can't clap just when the music stops." And there's, we do have a lot of sort of norms and rituals around Western classical music that are very disabling and that can make people feel unwelcome, or that make if someone's going to get a dirty look when they clap in the wrong place, or that they can't go and they can't enjoy a drink while they're having their while they're listening to their music, or there's a lot of kind of expectations around the ritual that that I think are limiting in that respect.
I would argue, though, that those rituals are tribal and they exist in all music. Because if I walked into a metal show, I would be made to feel not welcome, depending on the kind of audience that was there. And there would be ways of behaving that I don't know exactly how to behave. And so I think that each music, when I studied Indian music in India, I was learning I'm supposed to do this, I'm not supposed to do that, and so it's not just Western classical music that is like, oh, we're really off-putting and you don't belong. It's every music that does that.
It's generally human nature to feel like fish out of water.
Yeah. Well, and to go, oh, there's a fish that doesn't belong in my water.
I wanted to mention something, Chris, developing the idea of composer, performer, written, non-written. This is a big issue in intercultural music making because the fact is that the oral transmission, I studied in India, the oral transmission techniques are on a very, very high level, but it's a completely different economy. You know what I mean? But it's possible to do these things, but we just haven't yet gotten far enough to transmit orally certain ideas. I worked with a wonderful Sarangi player a few years ago, Farshid knows because we were together in Vancouver Cultural Orchestra. And he was willing to utilize part the Indian notations, and also said that the oral materials that I created for him were really very, very helpful. Now, I'd say that as the next generation will certainly, if the opportunity is there to work with composers who are willing to go the extra mile and work with them to get their parts right, and transmit them orally, I mean, this stuff can work. And there's no need to have an either-or scenario. I also wanted to say one more thing that came to my mind when I think it was Rachel or maybe Dee about getting council to encourage them to commission more women or queer arts and stuff like that. Actually, I think many of you know that there's a new paradigm in council starting next year, right? In which composers are going to ask for commissions. So you can create, I guess a connection. I don't know exactly how it works. We create a connection with an orchestra or an ensemble and stuff like that, and the composer initiates that with council. So it would be up to council more than ensembles would. Not completely, but I'm saying that maybe that's an opportunity to start working a little bit more and increasing opportunities for people. I can't speak for council, but it seems to me to be a new scenario. Do you know anything about that?
Well, that is what came to me, the message from Jeff, and then I picked up the phone and spoke to him about that. And so, hopefully that might affect a paradigm shift. Because what is clear in those numbers is that not enough organizations are putting forth women composers. So those
now it's not going to be up to the organizations only.
It's up to the composers to propose their projects.
Yeah. So they'll be.
In other words, don't they need an organization to agree, or an ensemble to agree?
They still need a letter from the ensemble.
I don't think we haven't seen the program, and if it acts like visual art, where an artist can say, I want to make this art, and they don't have to have an exhibition attached to it. So we haven't seen the program, so I don't know what it'll be, but it could function in a different way.
But, for me, the most successful artists that I've seen over the years are ones that do come knocking at the door. I mean, and we certainly, our job is to be out there and see what goes on, but you miss things, or sometimes you've or misunderstood something, right? It's easy to do that, and those people who are persistent because that they know that's what they want to do will come. They show back up, and it's those people that we want to encourage people to be independent in that way, to begin to broker those relationships, because that's what it is. It's about relationship building.
Stacey, I know you have a comment, but if she wanted to address the original question.
Yeah, so it was another comment that was about non-Western musicians and composers. In my experience, it's kind of like the other paradigm shift or power shift that exists when you're dealing with non-Western musicians is that unlike Western musicians that they know their rights dealing with the composer, like if it's something non-idiomatic on the instrument or unplayable, they will speak out and they'll say that, oh, I can't do that. You can't expect me to play this, I just change it. When I was dealing with Chinese musicians or Japanese musicians or even Persian musicians, they would think that this is black and white, this is God, it's given by God to them, and they have to do it. And I remember so many times just I have to tell the performer that, okay, I'm going to change it. No, it's on paper. Sure, but I'm the composer, I can change it. Oh, really? So it would take forever for them to actually understand that. So it's the paradigm is quite interesting.
Stacy.
I wanted to ask, it's sort of a follow-up to the idea of success coming from people being willing to continue knocking at the door. Mm-hmm. And I actually kind of was interested in what each of you thinks about ways in which we can encourage, as a community, more diverse groups of people, and I'm talking about gender and cultural groups, to come knocking at the door more, because I think that's one of the things that we're not seeing enough, is that insistence, that willingness to come out, and that we're not reaching out enough to those communities, the diversity that we see across the spectrum. So I wondered what you thought we could do in order to foster that kind of initiative amongst composers.
Education, again, at all levels along the way, where people feel that they're included. I think that's the most important thing, and give people that sense of confidence. And I still find it a challenge to work within the universities and just try to get students to come out to see events, to feel like they're part of the community. And there are particular places where that is a bit more successful, and that's because then they allow us to come into the classroom sometimes. So I think, to me, that's the pivotal place, and we just have to keep working at that. I've now, over the last couple of years, had there's a program out of San Francisco University that has internships, and I've had 2 young composers come in, and they're doing everything from helping us do production. They're not writing any music, but they're getting acculturated to what it is to be in the artistic world. And I would say any student that has ever crossed my threshold to come in to see something, that inevitably they'll end up being programmed just because of that sense of interest. So it's we have to go back to the professors. We have to go back to those places so that they understand that they're part of the community. The balance of all that starts as a student. The student is the teacher is the student, right? It's just, you've got to keep that going.
Your talk about the mirror and seeing yourself reflected, do you think that?
Certainly we found that in building our programming and in building our audiences, that seems to have a lot to do with it. I mean, our artistic direction is very proactive in seeking out the wide diversity within the LGBT community. I mean, we're one of the minorities where literally every other minority is also part of our community, and so we do make a point of when we look at our programming, we've tried always to see who's missing, and we make a point of seeking out artists, seeking out organizations. We do a lot of knocking on doors, and don't wait for people to come knocking on ours. And that we find the more that we do that, then more people come back from those communities, from other communities we've reached out to. We find that there seems to be very frequently a direct correlation between the communities and the identities of the artists presented and the communities and the identities of the audiences who come. That it's a fundamental need for people to see themselves reflected in art. And I think one of the big steps is making sure that you, as our organizations, that we program out, we're really conscious about our programming diversity, and then in terms of also trying to reach out through other community organizations who are often, we have yet to reach out to a community organization who said no, we're just not interested in partnering.
So it's really about building relationships that I'm getting from you, because I don't see why the Canada Council would want to flip altogether from musicians or organizations commissioning composers. Why can't it be both? Why can't composers ask for commissions with, and why can't the organizations continue to do the same thing? Because I think that would speak to this kind of relationship building. I, as a composer, am quite shocked that I should be able to create my own commissions, because I've never actually had that initiative. And it's always, people come to me and ask me to do something for them, and to be able to do that is a challenge.
But I think you probably don't count it as you put in an application to write for them. So,
right.
So it's who put in the application is different, but
why not both?
Essentially it's the same.
Yeah,
we don't know.
We don't know. So I mean, that would be just something to consider.
There's a question in the back.
I'm just wondering how the panel feels about, I don't even know how to word this because I don't even know what I'm actually thinking of, but there's some discomfort. I'm a performer and an artistic director and a curator, and sometimes I feel uncomfortable. I know my colleagues do too. When you're programming something and you're looking to fill, and I think maybe you were saying something about this, like a prescribed hole that you're filling for that sole purpose. Ideally, we just curate and the program represents diversity, right? Which, if you're young enough and you are a diverse thinker, you're an open-minded person, that happens, and it doesn't always happen. I don't know where that balance is. I wonder if anyone else struggles with, not necessarily themselves, but if they've watched other people struggle with, filling holes or checking boxes, if you will.
Well, that's fundotropism, and which we all face because it's put before us, and we're always trying to fill it up in a particular way, and it's identified that way. But it's affirmative action, and I there was importance in that coming out of Canadian heritage, and as prescriptive as it was, it did begin to affect some change going on, and it's about governance in a way, and it's how we react to that sense of governance and how we again reflect what's going on around us. So it's a dance. It's always a dance, and every time that I sit down to do stuff, and I go, there's just like there is a hole here. What's going on? Mm-hmm. I just did an LP. I really struggled, and it was archival material from our archives, and I just couldn't find the right balance within what that was going to be. They were all male soloists in that, and so it was diverse. Though there was Afro American, and John Kenneth Farag, who's I've just forgotten what his background is now. Just
Persian.
It's not Persian. No. Anyways, he's Canadian, Berlin-based musician. So that did fill all of that. But in order for me to feel comfortable with that, I wanted to find a woman to begin to write about that. And thank God, my buddy George Lewis had mentioned Dana Reason for some reason. I've never met Dana Reason. I don't know if you don't know her. She's a great Canadian pianist and a scholar, and she knew half of the artists on that. Little did I know. So that was my research to find a way to shore that up so that it would be feminized. It was feminized because I chose the material. I also worked with my assistant, who's a young pianist, and she was a composer, so that allowed that spin on that, so that we contextualize that work. So we did empower it in that way, but so you do struggle. It won't always fit in there. So that I would fear that if we're stuck with only putting stuff in the boxes, that's not going to work. But we have to be able to respond to that. And push for it. You can't lie down here. And I just want to make sure that people, that I wasn't misunderstood to say that I've given up on going out looking for people, or I've been doing intervention for a long time. But sometimes the onus does have to go back, or we all struggle from our sense of confidence, right? But you have to pick yourself up and come back again, and we have to be open when somebody comes back again, and to look at what the work is about.
We can't check off all of the boxes all of the time. I think that when we're looking at programming diversity, that it's important to take a look not only at the individual concert at the individual season, but as a sort of longer track record, seeing what fits within, seeing what fits within that. I have to admit, I feel more discomfort when I notice boxes that have been in my organization that have repeatedly not been getting ticked off. And, we sometimes, for example, one of the initiatives that we're taking in light of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the recommendations there, we're dedicating our 2017 festival to Two-Spirit and other queer-identified Indigenous artists. So this is a festival that is not going to be particularly diverse. We're not going to have, not going to be racially diverse. But within the context of our overall programming, it fills a very, particular niche. It fills also a particular, within our communities, Two-Spirit people are really radically underserved. And so it's an intervention in that respect.
It's a really good point.
Exactly. There's not a comment.
So I always like allow for the comment.
I just, we're trying to, we have several things on the table that we're looking at between our organizations and building those, and because you do see a gap, or why would I do this all by myself, right? That look to another organization or a group of artists that can inform that. They're much better skilled at that, or have, or connected to those communities. So it's pretty exciting, actually. That every time that you open a door, that's why I've done this for a long time. Is opening those doors.
If I may, dealing as a artistic, composer in residence with Boyko, we do quite a bit of programming, and our mandate is intercultural. But nevertheless, we try to have huge diversity, and we're very cautious about it and conscious about it. But sometimes we run into problems that address the other side of the work, which is the artists or composers, that are not willing to be part of another entity. So, for instance, the pool of the composers that we've been working, when I started working with people, it was very small, and many composers didn't want to be associated with this project because they were scared. And surprisingly, when I was talking to even David Harrington of Kronos, he said he had the same problem. People don't want to be associated with projects that are kind of has different cultures in it. And similarly, I realized that we made quite a bit of effort to actually, within the past few years, we had maybe more than 15 or 20 new composers to work with us. And we try to have diversity within that. But some groups are less open to get involved. And at times, I see that you can't help not to have enough diversity. At times, I can just give you one example that maybe of 6 or 7 women composers that we approached. More than half of them were very cautious to get involved and write a new piece, get a commission. So, that's the other side. You want to commission someone and they don't want to get a commission. Or I ask people we want to perform your work. Can I have 5 pieces? We have room for 1 piece. Can we do just 1 piece for now? And so they just make it so difficult that, as an organizer, you can't fulfill it. And so the name would be kind of pushed aside. And then if they don't come back, I probably won't go back to them.
Farshid, if I might just add to what you just said. See, from the very beginning of this intercultural project, there are some people, and it's totally, and I hope it will always be an open choice of the artist. Some people like the idea of exploring this bridge and this hybridization, and some people don't, or some artists don't. And for any culture, right? So, in a sense, that's why I called it the intercultural, because it is, at least in my understanding, it assumes an approach on both sides, right? And it has to be an open approach on both sides.
Yeah.
So that is, that could be just an artistic decision. It's something I don't feel comfortable. I don't want to go there. I want to explore.
Yeah, it's okay. But basically, what I'm saying is that you can't always have as much diversity. Now, the other side of it, as a composer, I've been approaching many organizations, and like I have this piece, or I would like to write for you, or whatever. And one of the weirdest responses that I've heard very often was that, how can we incorporate a piece of a Persian composer in our program? And makes me feel that, do I need to be writing a specific genre of music, or do you need to have a program of Persian composers to have a piece of, like, a person who's not white?
I guess that's
Which
the
I
other
doubt
side of
that
it. Like, how do you feel when you're the person that's trying to, like,
So basically, it goes both ways. It goes both ways. So I think that as like a curator, you want to be as open as you want to be, but at the same time, sometimes the artists are the ones that are to blame.
I think there's a comment.
Go ahead, Rachel. Let's go after you.
I was just going to say that I think diversity doesn't always look like we expect it to. And that can come from both sides. I think that a lot of the time you'll end up with expectations, perhaps from a mainstream, that don't recognize diversity when they see it. I remember it was one year where we had an exhibition where we had, it was to that point the most diverse visual arts lineup that we had, and we had a really strong representation from Indigenous artists, from queer and trans people of color, from a really diverse gender spectrum as well. And we had some comments from particularly from white people complaining that there weren't enough non-white people in the exhibition. But they didn't recognize the people that weren't, they didn't recognize the people of color as people of color because they didn't see, they were looking for particular skin tones, and they didn't see that particularly reflected. It's a similar, like the Farshid story where the expectation that,
for the Shadowcatch opera, we had 4 composers, 2 women, 2 men. The only truly Canadian was Jennifer, was Dorothy Chang, and Benton Rourke and myself. And the criticism from one of the funding agencies was that we don't have diversity.
We didn't have any Japanese people. That was a fair criticism perhaps, because it was a no-based project.
But they didn't say that.
But they didn't say that.
They say it's not.
It was very diverse.
Yeah.
Sounds like me.
This discussion of diversity and inclusion is happening all around. Often when we try to program in a way that is around equality, people say, "Oh, but my program is all about the best music."
Oh.
And and so now I worry that when people start talking about ticking boxes, it's a way of saying, "Oh, you're not doing the best music." Because when you have a concert that's all male, you're not doing the best music. You're just doing those guys. Like, it's not like every guy writes great music. And so I do worry that this current language around ticking boxes is becoming a little bit of a stand-in for lowering standards. Because I don't think, I disagree that, we have to fill out grants and show stats and show that we're reflecting the community from which we're taking money. I do think that many people actually look at their programming in ways that are about reflecting their community, or in different things. Like, it's not responding to grants, it's actually responding to their human need to exist in this community in a different kind of way.
I think it's also, when we think about, I think that's right, we often have the wrong boxes, too. There's an element of that. There's discussion about, Dave and I were just talking about that in terms of, because collecting stats and then asking about gender. And I mean, really, in many ways, in our organization, we actually never ask people about their gender. We ask them what pronoun they want to be referred to, what pronoun they would like to have used. But the gender is one of the perfect examples where, for many organizations, they have 2 boxes, and those are the boxes that they look at. And there's actually quite a lot of people that don't fit either of those boxes or overlap. Some of these boxes are more like Venn diagrams, and
that comes up with genre.
Yeah.
I'm often being used to fill the boxes. Either me myself as individual or ensembles, and we just I don't care if we book because we book to fill the boxes. I think we still deliver the best project we can. But when we were doing our first equity grant application with the Canada Council, it was interesting that you have to identify a cultural context as your community, and which is a little hard for us because we are being expected to serve Chinese community, and we expected to have our audience to be Chinese, our staff to be all Chinese, which is not the case. We have over half our audience are not Chinese. And most are on tour. We're playing in places that they've never seen any Chinese walking on their streets, like small communities. And we are hired there because they don't have access to this. So this is another way around. Like we're expected to serve a certain culture only, but for us, we just want to be playing music as musicians, and we never actually totally fit that model, but. So that's another perspective, I guess, performer. And one thing is that I think many people are afraid of with the instruments. They say they don't know how to compose for those instruments. They don't know how to do it. So part of it is to giving the information. So I put this up. We created the study guides on each of our Chinese instruments in the ensembles. And that's free access for anyone who's interested to learn about the instruments. And we'll be adding more instruments. So this I think is probably the most detailed in English, the explanation of the instruments.
Yeah, just responding to your comment, David, about, I'm not going to word it properly, but...
About the grant thing.
Yeah, well, but it's about being responsive to our community and taking responsibility to see what there is out there. And sometimes what I'm all just trying to get at is sometimes we miss things, right? Just because we're busy filling up those boxes. Anyways, I'm not saying that I'm there to fill out those boxes by any means. It's just being open to what is there within the community, and then having to look beyond that because you're dealing with that framework. So, and the larger framework that we have to deal with because we are not for profit, and we have to be able to somehow translate to what we've been given to look at.
The more boxes, the better. And in many ways, I feel like the more. We feel that the greater diversity means greater quality. That's.
Thank you for your comments on all that. Yeah, interesting.
All right. Okay. I'm trying to form this into a question. I guess earlier. This year, the agriculture picture? Yeah, it was in November. I was part of this project, I'm sorry that Moshe left, but I got to work with I got to write a piece for a Centaur and string quartet. And the concert happened the week of the bombings in Paris. And I went to that concert and I realized we were in this room of people who were from all different cultures. There were Chinese instruments, there were Persian instruments, there were Western instruments. And I was so moved suddenly because of all the press and all the racism and all the stuff that was happening in the media, that to be in this concert where all these people were working together and creating just this beautiful music, and it really moved me. And I guess I feel like that's kind of what is the heart of all this work that we're all trying to do, is we're combating something that's really serious and really horrible and really dangerous and violent, And so I think when you were talking, Lan, just a second ago, this is how it formed into a question for me, where you said you go into these communities and these people have never had enough access to Chinese music and you just want to play music, but actually you're doing so much more. You're a cultural ambassador, right? And anytime any of us step up for something like, programming women or talking about lack of diversity or anything, we're all kind of being ambassadors in a sense. And I guess, how do we learn to do that better? How do we? That's because it's not part of what we're trained to do. We're trained to make music, and that's a big part. Like Rachel said, art is really powerful, and making the art is a really powerful thing. But I think there's another step that we, sometimes we have to take, or we feel like we're forced to take. And how do we learn how to do that better? I guess, in a sense, like if we're confronted with racism or if we're confronted with bigotry, like how do we as musicians learn to cope with that? Maybe that's my question. I'm looking for
I do a lot of touring, but mostly in the States. Unfortunately, just Canadian touring market is really difficult. You spend more than what you're making. Cost is a lot higher, and then also the universities here cannot afford programs. So we do a lot of this kind of educational programs in the U.S. and going into different communities. And it is the exposure because they had never experienced the instruments before. And as soon as we start our concert, it breaks the preconception of how the instruments should sound like and how the music should sound like, especially because the program we present is not all pentatonic as they get expected. And it's not all the beautiful film music kind of the style they hear in the movies. And so the diversity in our programming always surprises the audience, and that is part of the exposure and the sincere and passion in the music as a performer also connects with the community. And I just wish in Canada the different the schools can actually pay a lot more, so we can do more Canadian tour. We haven't been doing very much in Canada as much as in the US.
I guess as a Canadian, I realized that one of our features, if I can say as a Canadian, is not having a sense of history. And sense of history can come with really big baggages and difficulties that you would see most of the world fighting, but it also has some benefits. Part of it is that often we don't recognize that it's a premiere of a new work, and we don't go because we have other things. But if you have that sense of history, that a new work is coming to birth, and we should see it, we should be there, we should be part of it. So having a sense of history would help us to actually think that, okay, what we're doing right now is not just a small thing in a small village, in a small part of the world for 10 people. It's going to affect others. And I feel that could be maybe helping us if we start to think about it a little bit bigger than our small box and surroundings. Like we were talking about that example, a few years ago we were in Amsterdam for Atlas Academy, which is a similar organization. And musicians were coming actually from other places. And it was the weekend that there was a massacre in Norway. That guy decided to go and kill a number of people. And one of the MPs in the Netherlands, actually was from Amsterdam, decided that that's a good idea. And he was very openly supporting that concept of attacking other races. So it turned out that actually they have to call police to come and have a security guard around a conference of musicians and composers getting together from other places and playing together, just bizarre instruments. And the organizers were really concerned that something is going to happen. Nothing happened, but that's basically the work we are doing.
If I could just speak a little bit to that, I do think that our in Canada, we often, I think this lack of historicity relates directly to our colonial heritage and to, I mean, you often hear people say, well, in Canada we don't have a history, or we don't have a history for very long, because we cut off our history at a certain point and ignore that there was, that there are millennia of history on these lands. But, I think there's aspects of our history that are so horrifying to look at that we turn away. And I think that, Farshid's comment speaks to the way, I mean, there are many more concrete ways that denial of the genocide that's taking place in this country has affects us. But I think, that's one way as artists where this, that we don't, we've lost this, because we have this kind of denial around having a history, and it's given us a loss of historical context that affects us in the way we look at all of our art.
I really hate to have to stop us right there, but unfortunately we are out of time. We've heard a lot today, and have a lot to think about now, and I really encourage people to seek out and further explore this dialogue as they go about the world here. So at this moment, though, I would like to really thank all of you for your contributions today. Thank you for